Good afternoon and welcome to the Institute for Government for this event looking at how can government ensure it learns effectively from the past in making public finance decisions. Today's event marks the culmination of a long-running programme funded by the Nuffield Foundation examining the history of the UK's planning and control of public expenditure between 1993 and 2015. This project was carried out by a team at the Blavatnik School of Government led by Christopher Hood, who's on our panel today, but also his co-authors there, I think some of whom are also here today, Maia King, Barbara Piotrowska, and also Iain McLean. Also contributing to the wider project was a team from the Institute for Fiscal Studies, which were led by Paul Johnson. We at the IFG have been involved in this project from the start, helping to disseminate the findings of that. So I'm really pleased that we can be here today to mark the launch of the excellent book, The Way the Money Goes, available at all good bookshops if you haven't already got yourself a copy, which looks in detail at this period of public spending management. And I'm really pleased we can be here today to reflect on what we've learned from that period through the 1990s, 2000s and early 2010s. And what that means for policymakers today thinking about public spending management. We're very grateful to the Nuffield Foundation for supporting this event and for supporting obviously the wider project itself, helping to use historical analysis to inform public policy today. We're going to kick off our event with some opening remarks from Mark Franks from the Nuffield Foundation. Unfortunately, Mark has been struck down by the evil COVID, so isn't able to be here with us today in person, but he should be above my head on the screen. So I'll hand over to Mark now to make a few opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Gemma. I'm really sorry I couldn't be there today. But what I was going to do was just speak a little about the Nuffield Foundation, why we funded this work, and the importance of independence and impartiality. So the Nuffield Foundation has three domains of research interest: education, justice, and welfare. And I'm the director of the welfare domain. Prior to joining the foundation, I spent about 20 years working in the civil service. Some of that was actually spent at the Treasury, where I was responsible for the Green Book, which I was delighted to see gets a few pages of discussion in this book. But I was also an economist in a number of departments, often developing the economic case to convince the Treasury to support their priorities. So I've had some personal experience of the issues we'll be discussing today from both sides of the fence. In terms of my current role, the Nuffield Foundation supports rigorous research and analysis with the aim of changing people's lives for the better. And I'll come back to that final point about changing people's lives at the very end of these brief remarks. But I wanted to say, as well as funding research, we founded and host three institutes: the Nuffield Council of Bioethics, the Nuffield Family Justice Observatory, and the Ada Lovelace Institute. And across all of these different activities, as an endowed charity, we don't have to raise funds, and we have the freedom to be independent and non-partisan in all of our work. And I do think independence is vital to a piece of work like this. There's no question in my mind that this team, either the Oxford team or the IFS team, would allow their independence to be compromised, but nevertheless being able to demonstrate independence of funding is also important. And I think it's particularly important in the current climate, where the findings of this research are incredibly timely, and therefore it's just more important that they need to be listened to. And to illustrate that, yesterday, before testing positive for COVID, I was at the launch of the Resolution Foundation Economy 2030 inquiry report, which was also funded by the Nuffield Foundation. And anybody who was there or has read about it will know that work provides a very sober review of the UK's economic situation: low growth, low productivity, high inequality, high inflation, and high national debt. But that work was also very focused on solutions. And the single most important factor it identified was investment. And that analysis, by its nature, focused more on levels of public sector investment, which are low in the UK relative to other countries and have been for many decades. But clearly how money is invested is also hugely important. the key question of how do we invest in a way that maximises the returns for the economy and society, and no more so than in a context when the public finances are already extremely squeezed. And this book reminds us that history does repeat itself, and much can be learned from past attempts to answer very similar questions. And there is perhaps a tendency by economists to over-focus on what needs to be done rather than how it's done. And this book is a useful corrective in that respect. So that's the current context. But when we funded it, we also hoped that researchers and policymakers would still be finding this research valuable in 20, 30 or 40 years' time. And I hope that future historians will look at this research, how it was funded and who did it, and be completely confident in its rigour, reliability and accuracy. And on one final point, I started off by saying that the purpose of the research that we at the Foundation fund was to change people's lives for the better. And a lot of our research addresses that need in a very direct way, focusing on some of the most vulnerable members of society and how they can be helped. However, although it's less direct, even incremental improvements in how we manage the public finances, because of the sheer scale of the issues, can have huge impacts on people's lives, and be that through the tax or benefit system, the funding of public services, or through promoting the growth of the economy. And it's more so when you consider how the effects will accumulate over years or decades. So we're very happy that this research fully supports us in our mission to improve people's lives, and we're proud to have funded it, and are looking forward to the rest of today's discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark, and I'm sorry again you couldn't be here with us today. For the rest of the event, we will be tweeting from @IFG events using the hashtag IFG public spending, so please do follow and tweet along if you are into that sort of thing. We will have time for question and answers at the end, so if you're watching online, please do start putting your questions into Slido using the panel that should be next to the screen that you're watching this event on. On the panel today, I am really pleased that we are joined by, firstly, Christopher Hood, who, as I said, really spearheaded this programme of work, working with his colleagues at the Blavatnik School, who will be able today to start by setting out some of the key findings from his work and set the scene for this discussion. The work that Christopher's team were able to do required close working with the Treasury as well to gain access to the sort of archival material that they drew on. So I'm also very pleased that we're joined by Conrad Smewing, who's the Director General for Public Spending at the Treasury now, and has also held multiple roles within public spending in the Treasury as well as elsewhere in government. So very pleased that Conrad's here to talk, perhaps draw the links between this historical work and where things now are in government. We're also joined by Sir Charlie Bean, who is now Professor of Economics at the London School of Economics. Has obviously had a very long career in various public sector organisations, but for the purposes of today's discussion also served as the chair of the advisory group for this project, and so sort of seen it from the original inception of the project through to today, and can reflect on what expectations were then and what we now look back on. And finally, joined by my colleague Dr. Catherine Haddon, who is our in-house historian at the IFG and has wide experience using historical analysis to inform the sort of work that we do on effective government. So I'm very pleased that Kath can be here to reflect more broadly on how historical analysis can help to contribute to government operations. So Christopher, let me start with you. What were the key findings from this, and what were the sort of challenges, and how did you overcome those in doing this sort of piece of work?
Well, I've got 6 questions down here, and I'm going to give about a couple of minutes to each of them. And I'm just going to pick up 2 books that I want to show to you. So, question number 1 is, how did this project arise? Was it an academic initiative? Second, why choose to put its main output into the form of a book? Third question, why wasn't the book published in the form of an official history? If you want an authoritative account of past events, why not do it that way? Fourth question, why can't you just rely on the Treasury's archives for learning about past successes and failures and cut out the middleman? So, fifth question. Why did the book appear 2 years behind schedule? Is this a typical case of academic dilatoriness or something else? And then third, coming to your question, what are the 3 top-line conclusions from the study in the book? So, why did the project arise? Was it academic initiation? There's a saying that if you appoint a committee of admirals, they'll recommend to you that you build more battleships. If you appoint a committee of professors, they'll tell you that you need more research. But in this case, it wasn't really like that. The original impetus for this study came from some senior Treasury officials rather than from academics. Those Treasury officials wanted to augment the Treasury's institutional memory, exactly what we're talking about today. And they wanted a book to be written in a broadly non-partisan style. I think academic credibility was the word that went into the Nuffield's call for research. And they wanted a qualitative account of developments in public expenditure control over the period from 1993 to 2015, a period when you had ups and downs in the economic cycle, right and left-wing governments, and other variations too. How exactly it happened, I don't know. Conrad may know, but I believe that George Osborne is said to have signed up to Treasury cooperation with this project in one of his last acts as Chancellor in 2016. So that's how the project initiated. Then, second question, why was its main output in the form of a book? Well, that's because it's what the Treasury officials who wanted the project called for, that they hoped that such an account would be useful to their successors a decade or so on, as they had found an earlier book. Here it is. I've lugged it along today to prove that it exists, by Colin Thane and Maurice Wright. And this is a hefty volume, 553 pages, that took 8 years to write. Beside that, our little book is a tiddler. Then moving on, why wasn't the book published as an official history, a long established way of trying to pass on lessons learned in the past to future generations? There was a lot of that after World War I and World War II, writing about economic planning in the wars and that kind of thing. And indeed, my academic supervisor at the University of Glasgow, you'll note I've got that tie on today, was Bill Mackenzie, who wrote the official history of the Special Operations Executive. This was the Black Ops organization in World War II, working on sabotage, undercover operations and the like, all highly sensitive stuff, of course. And Mackenzie wrote this book in 1947. It was published, guess when? 2002. And even what has been published, you can see this is another hefty volume. It's 800 pages. This is only 2/3 of the original book. And so I think that shows you some of the downsides of official histories as well as the upsides. And I think that there are good reasons for choosing a different format in this case. I don't know exactly what the Treasury's thought processes were about it, but certainly after World War II, there was a great deal of criticism from anti-waste campaigners against the use of official histories on the grounds that what greater waste of public money could there be than to commission professors to write books no one was going to read. And the Treasury had quite a hard time at that point. A certain Captain Waterhouse went on about that. And one of the advantages of the Treasury not funding the project and not having an official history might well have been something like that. And then, next question, why not rely on HM Treasury's archives for learning about past successes and failures? Well, my father, who died 20 years ago, was conscripted into the Logistics Corps in World War II in British Army, RASC as it was called then. These are the people that move stuff from A to B and people to fit in with battle plans. And I remember my father talking to me about how they did the archives in the military in those days. What they had were large, standard size wooden boxes. And any paper that came up in running a unit got thrown into the box. And you knew that you could estimate roughly how many centimeters in the box any week or month would take up with papers distributed like that. And the only way that you could find anything was if you had some rough idea of when it had taken place, because then you could go down the requisite number of centimeters in the box and find the right box. And it was a bit like that famous story by Juan Luis Borges about the Library of Babel, a library that's got everything, but there's no catalogue. It would be certainly a great exaggeration to say that the Treasury archives are like that. But they do point to some of the challenges in archiving, and actually there are worse ways of doing it than that way. But there is a question which would be nice to discuss as to how far have we moved on from those primitive days in this age of searchable digital collections and the like. And what I think was some bits of Treasury put in quite a lot of effort into systematic archiving, others less so. And I think we particularly found the GEP and Treasury Officer of Accounts archiving more systematic than other parts. But we repeatedly came across issues of poor file migration, lots of empty folders, issues of missing or unreadable document attachments. So if you get the sort of classic civil service communication, dear so-and-so, we spoke, see attachment, but the attachment's not there or it's not readable. And then, of course, there's the issue of the documents that never made their way into the archives anyway, because to archive something, even in these wonderful days of digital records, means that you have to have a keystroke response, and that's where the problems start. Then, where have I got to? Next question, why did it take so long? Well, we designed the project as a two-stage rocket. The first bit was to get on top of the numbers for what happened to public spending over the 22 years we were looking at. That was done by the people who know those numbers inside out, Paul Johnson, who was a co-investigator, and Rowena, Crawford, and Ben Zaranko. And they did a wonderful job of putting those numbers together, and we introduced those to a meeting like this in July 2018. So far, so good. But the book took quite a lot longer, mainly because of COVID and its knock-on effects. And we're certainly doing a lot better than Bill McKenzie did. And then concluding, you'll be glad to know, 3 top-line conclusions. One, very briefly, there's a lot of inertia in this spending system. There's a lot that didn't change, and we do spell some of that out. Professor Richard Rose at the University of Strathclyde, who's worked on taxation policy in the 1970s and 80s, saw inertia as a very strong feature of the tax system in the UK, partly for political reasons. And we found something, quite a lot of areas in which we could say that not a whole lot changed. And then second top-line conclusion, if we think not so much of individual organisations, but of a fiscal constitution comprised of rules, conventions, practices of how to decide things, like how you decide what the size of the budget should be or what have you. There were sets of rules and procedures that together formed a fiscal constitution, but many of the rules seemed to be quite flexible or bendable. And it reminded us of Alexis de Tocqueville's famous characterization of Bourbon France before the Revolution, in which he said, what was it, une pratique molle, une règle rigide, rigid rules and lax enforcement. We didn't find it quite like that, but certainly we found the rules were variable. And then finally, one of the fascinating things of watching how spending developed over the 22 years that we looked at was that all sorts of interesting developments took place on the edge of what counted as spending or what counted as debt. And the amount of ingenuity that went into finding new ways of resourcing things that didn't quite fit into what counted as debt or spending was certainly a feature of what we saw. And I believe there's an old Treasury joke that goes, there is no fiscal crisis that cannot be dealt with by swinging classification changes. And it's one of those half-truths that's funny, but there is we did find a good deal of what you could call stealth spending as well as stealth taxes. That's it. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Christopher. So, Conrad, I noticed in the green room earlier you had a very well-thumbed looking copy of this book already. So for you, as someone in the Treasury now, what's the benefit of working with this sort of academic work, and what do you draw out of it?
Well, first of all, I'm delighted to be here. It's not often that someone writes the perfect book just for you, but that's exactly what this is. I'm a kind of an ex-historian. This is a history book. It's public spending control of the last 20 years, which I seem to have spent most of my time doing, and it's also very practical and focused on how the thing actually works rather than on the theory of it, and that makes it all the more useful. It's also got the added excitement that I'm a kind of bit part player in some of the chapters. I recognise that being there for the 2005 near cash, non-cash switching scandal is not quite the Kennedy assassination, but it was a sort of nice nostalgic feel to it. What are the benefits for the Treasury of this kind of work? I mean, the Treasury puts a lot of effort into exactly this kind of this kind of thing, both academic histories and teaching our officials about the history of the Treasury and the history of economic policy, precisely because we see a great deal of value in it for what we do today. And I suppose I'd pick out sort of three different kinds of thing that we get out of it. The first one is the sort of classic lessons of history thing. It's inevitable that policymakers will draw on historical analogies. In economic policy, we're always asking, is this more like the 1930s or more like the 1970s? I'm sure we will ask, is this like the pandemic in future? And that is, a kind of useful way of framing how to think about things, but it is quite risky. You can see in the way that foreign policymakers use historical analogies, the lessons of the summer of 1914 lead to Munich in 1939. The sort of spectre of Munich lies over lots of the post-war interventions. And so the kind of key, if you're going to do that kind of thinking, is to really get in and understand what are the essential features of this analogy that you're thinking about, what's the same and what's different, and really understanding what happened in the kind of detailed way that this book does, I think is really, really crucial for that. The second real benefit is just kind of understanding what has survived. Like, why do we have the institutions that we currently have, which is sort of key to dealing with the problem of Chesterton's fence. I don't know if anyone here knows about Chesterton's fence, but it's a sort of principle of public policy reform that for some reason we owe to a writer of detective fiction in the 30s, which is if you're kind of going for a walk and you see a fence and you've got no reason, you don't understand why it's there, it's a very bad idea to tear it down, because you're liable, once you've wandered on for a bit, to get gored to death by a bull. So, if you're dealing with something like public spending, which has a very great deal of fences, which, sometimes it's difficult to understand why they're there, having a history like this to tell you, well, this is why the administration costs regime is there, or why we have this near cash versus non-cash distinction or whatever, that is incredibly valuable. And then I think the third thing is that a bit of historical perspective allows you to see the things which otherwise you're too close to them to see. So sort of give an example, if you kind of pick up any Treasury paper from the IMF crisis in the 1970s, you're likely to sort of read it and say, what the hell is domestic credit expansion? And why do they keep going on about it? Where are all the scorecards? Where are the policy costings? Where are the borrowing numbers? And then you think about it for a bit and you realise that if you've got a Treasury which has got control of both monetary and fiscal levers at the same time, it makes a lot more sense to focus on something which both of them are feeding into, i.e. domestic credit expansion. And that helps you to see just what a big change the independence of the Bank of England is in the way that we think about macroeconomic policy. Totally changes all of the way that the Treasury thinks about policy issues, because we've split off the monetary authority and we've given it to Charlie and he's sorting it out. So those are the sort of three key benefits that I think we get from it. And as I say, the Treasury, I'm delighted to have this book. The work that we do with the Strand Group on UK, the Treasury and UK economic policy, really, really valuable. And all of the kind of ad hoc events and seminars that we do, just like really valuable for all of our staff.
Great. Thank you. I'll come back to several of those points in a second, but Kath, let me come to you first. From your experience, how good is government at learning from the past, and what are the challenges and opportunities of doing that?
It struggles, but it struggles in a very human way. And I mean, a lot of us do. And one of those issues is just institutional memory. We at the Institute talk a lot about the sort of churn, the high turnover of ministers and of officials, and the impact that can have on then churn and turnover of policy making as well. And institutional memory effectively comes from people who are allowed the time and effort to develop deep expertise, deep domain knowledge, and also an organisation that has a culture of learning and wants to sort of review what it did in the past, look back and question. But politics, by its very essence, is very forward-looking. Everything is happening rapidly. You're having to find new solutions. Time is of an essence, and there are reasons why the turnover that I've talked about happens. So there is a bit of a sort of inherent clash there. But that doesn't mean that there isn't a desire to learn better. We talk to former ministers for our Ministers Reflect series of exit interviews. Very good historical resource if anyone wants it. And it's really fascinating when you have a minister who has been in a job for a long period of time saying about their frustration of coming across the officials, and they knew more about the past policies and the past efforts to solve an issue that had been done previously. So there is something about, could we do better of using that resource? It is, a resource that we spend money on, training people up, getting them to understand a policy, an issue, and then the risk is that it gets lost. there's some more fundamental practical issues, and Christopher's talked about it in terms of record management and how you sort of systemize the knowledge that you are developing. And we have, in the last 25 years, had a real struggle over that, as have people worldwide, with changing digital structures of retaining records, of the ways in which we communicate with each other, of file management and things getting lost and so forth. So it is a problem, and I always tell the joke of, it's not a joke, it's real, of every few years somebody from the Cabinet Office gets in touch with me because they've been told that I'm the person to speak to about institutional memory. And so I have to start the whole conversation again, and it keeps cycling onwards. But it's just a reminder. But this is an example of, as Christopher said, of Whitehall actually pushing for wanting institutional memory. And I think one person who deserves credit for that, I don't know if he was the instigator behind this, I think Sharon White was involved, but Nick McPherson, who actually both the Strand Group progress, enthusiasm for this, and also in the Treasury, a lot of the enthusiasm for institutional memory, the sort of history groups and so forth that I've attended and others. And he says that it was really during the financial crash where, not only was he looking back at past financial crashes going back to the early 20th century and really benefiting from the history of giving him perspective and so forth, but he also found it incredibly valuable for the staff, many of whom had not been through a recession, let alone a crash of that extraordinary scale, for them to understand how things can happen differently. So actually, as Conrad just said, seeing things that otherwise you're too close to see, it is that sort of long duration history is just as important as the sort of remembering bits and pieces. It's a bit of a shame that we've lost official histories. I think it was 2011 that they got cancelled, which is probably one of the reasons why certainly nobody pressed you for that. But I think there are other ways to do history, and sometimes those big tomes, those big books, they're almost too big for the information to be disseminated. So a very readable book, I have been reading it, it grabs you early on, is often the way to actually engage people, and then also just getting out and talking to them and disseminating it and going and talking to people in the Treasury and stuff like that. So I hope that, it's only the start of people coming back to the book, coming back to the knowledge of the team, and, showing that sort of same fervour and interest in learning from the past.
Thanks very much, Kath. Charlie, so as I said at the start, you chaired the advisory group for this project. And as Christopher said, the project was originally conceived several years ago, and a lot happened in that time, most notably COVID. For you, how did the objectives of the book, how did it sort of evolve, and how do you now see it relative to perhaps what you might have expected when it was first conceived?
Well, in some sense, the object of the project is timeless, because it is to record the lessons of history during the particular period that was looked at, which I guess encompasses three administrations with different contexts. So initially the recovery from the post-ERM exit recession, then obviously the new Labour years, and then we're into the financial crisis and austerity and so forth. And that's a mix of particularly interesting periods to look at. The thing about history, I completely endorse Catherine's comments on the importance of history. Just reflecting on my time at the bank with the financial crisis, going back and looking at past banking and financial crises was extremely instructive. But you can't just take off the shelf what's happened in the past, but there will be some lessons that you can draw, and studies like the Reinhardt and Rogoff study of 800 years of financial crisis was, extremely helpful as providing us a crutch to lean our thinking on. But you have to think also, how is the current context different? How is the world different? In what ways might the appropriate responses be different now? So I think the important thing going forward, thinking, well, how can we use the results of this study? Is, it tells us a lot about how civil servants and policymakers were conducting fiscal policy through the period, but we're entering another period which is going to be highly challenging for fiscal policy. Despite all the hoo-ha over about the last 50 years, the share of government spending in GDP had been roughly constant, wiggled around a bit, but beneath the surface, big underlying shifts with an increase in the share of spending on health and social security and on welfare, going up from about a quarter of that spending up to it's nearly a half now. And that was made room for by falling public investment, big cuts in defence spending, end of the Cold War, end of empire, all of that, and falling debt interest. Now, all three of those elements are now going the other way, and the forces that drove up health spending and welfare spending, which a lot of which is pensions, it's demography is one of the key things that's driving that ageing. So looking forward, you have tremendous pressures for increased public spending. Now, neither party is really confronting this. We saw the Chancellor basically at the autumn statement penciling in implausibly tight spending for non-protected departments beyond the end of the current spending review, and Labour sort of implicitly saying, we'll go along with this sort of thing. But it's going to be a big issue which will have to be dealt with in one way or the other going forward. It could involve changing what the state does or accepting higher taxes or whatever. But anyway, there's a big debate out there. But part of that is also going to be how do we control the various elements of public spending and manage them more efficiently, and in a context where there are new issues that are going to be thrown up with things like artificial intelligence, vast increase in the amount of data that can be used for managing public spending, and so forth. So even if the object of Chris's project wasn't changed, the context, the external context, and potentially the lessons drawn will have evolved.
Yeah, great. I mean, on that point then, I wanted to dig a bit more into some of the points that you draw out in your book, Christopher, and actually to Charlie's point about the need to get more from public spending and make sure that it is being done well, particularly in the context of growing pressures for that public spending. One of the points that you highlight in your book is the challenges that can arise from the asymmetry of information between the Treasury and spending departments, that the spending departments know far more about what they're doing, but they also have an incentive, I think is your point, to protect their budgets and to be a bit defensive of that. But you have an interesting vignette, particularly about the frontline first review of the Ministry of Defence in the early 1990s, which I think you point to as an example of a case where actually there was much closer joint working between the Treasury and the Ministry of Defence that identified genuine efficiency savings that could be made that result in quite a large budget cut there. I was just wondering if you could reflect on that a bit and whether you think that has sort of lessons for what might be needed in the next phase if we really are looking to reform how things are done.
The honest answer would be that I don't know, but we included it in the book because we thought it was a rare case where spending controllers dealing with a department that's very well known to be a deep, detailed department. These guys are really serious. They have loads of expertise, and there's no other department in Whitehall that's like it. And getting inside such an organisation is problematic. And I think, I don't know whether Conrad would agree with this, but what we certainly gathered in our book, and preparing for the book, was that relations between defence were very variable over the period and the Treasury. And to hit the jackpot, you've really got to have, from the Treasury's point of view, you've really got to have good relations both at the official level and at the ministerial level. And what was certainly notable about that Frontline First study, not totally forgotten, of course, by just about everyone today, is that you had precisely a meeting of minds on both sides. It doesn't often happen. A decade later, it was all bets off. So I think that's one point that I would make about it. And the other thing, going back to what Kath Hatton was saying about looking for where the institutional memory is, it may not be in the place you first expect. It may not be in the so-called permanent officials who aren't always very permanent anyway. I remember doing a study of the regulator Oftel in the 1990s, which had a massive staff turnover, 40%, something like that. And the only people, and the organisation tended to make mistakes. It had repeat mistakes it had made quite a short time before. And the only people who could really remember anything or in a position to do so was the consultants. And that was where the institutional memory is. But you just need to know where to look for it.
Conrad, on this point, is this something you are thinking about in the Treasury, and do you have ways of approaching that these days?
Well, so I mean, it is a kind of perennial, the relationship between the Treasury and departments, as the book kind of well illustrates, can go up and down. I think there is, there's a quote from one of my anonymous colleagues in there that, part of the role of the official Treasury is to keep relations strong with officials and departments if there happens to be a kind of, a political disagreement. And I think that is a very important thing that we definitely strive to do. I think the other thing that's sort of interesting in this regard is I went sort of straight to the chapter on gaming and classification and stuff, which I think is really interesting because there is sort of one reaction from some of my, I guess, former colleagues of you've got to keep changing the rules to keep them on the toes. I think that's sort of deeply sort of cynical response, and the more grown-up response, which I think is the one that has won through, is to sort of reduce, I think, in the jargon, the relational distance between the Treasury and departments. So basically, make sure everyone understands where they're coming from, that they're on the same side, that no one is surprising anyone else, and that, in my experience, has been the most effective way for the Treasury to operate. And some of the things that we've done since the period covered in this book, like the way that the government finance function has been embedded into the Treasury and into departments, have actually helped that quite a lot.
Kath, on this point about relationships, from your work, how important are those relationships at official and ministerial level? And is there anything from your sort of ministerial reflections that get it out of it?
Yeah, I mean, the relationships are incredibly important. At the moment, you may or may not know, but there's going to be a general election at some point in the next year and a bit. So some of the work that we do work with ministers, we do work with the opposition, and a lot of that is about how to understand Whitehall, how do things work, and we write a lot of guides about it, and we use Ministers Reflect to do that. And actually, some of what we're talking about today, it could be writ wide across all sorts of aspects of Whitehall. One of my favourite quotes from the book is from a former senior Treasury official talking about managing public money, saying it was an apparent rule book with the emphasis on apparent. And that could be true of the Constitution more generally, and how things operate, and some of the interdepartmental relationships that come out of all of this, because obviously money is one of the big issues across the whole of Whitehall. But it's true of all sorts of cross-government working and the sort of vested interests of different departments and understanding why, of course, every department's going to see it from their own perspective and going to want to protect their own area, and that's true of the money, it's true of sort of, collective responsibility and when policies clash and so forth. But actually, the gaming point is the most interesting, because one of the hardest things to explain to people is the sort of insider, how things really work kind of accounts of Whitehall that people really admire when somebody is a good player, to use another phrase. And it is something that people are both proud of and incredibly frustrated about, because why can't we all just, have some very clear sort of rules and systems and so forth. So it is hard to explain it to people when you're trying to both critique it and also tell them that, yeah, you probably want to learn this because it is going to carry on being that way. And one of the things that I like about this book is that it tries to step back from that and actually really analyse what is going on in all of that and take a more structured approach to understanding it, because I do think we've got a bit of a problem where people talk about it as if it's almost a joke and then criticise when we know the sort of bad behaviours that it can lead to, but also they kind of crave it and also want to be experts at it and are proud of themselves when they're really good at it and so forth. And that kind of dichotomy is one of the reasons why we struggle when we think about the sort of culture of Whitehall, the culture of government, and how we can fix the bad things whilst, not necessarily losing the things that are just classic human nature that you've just got to work through.
Charlie, I wanted to pick back up on the point that you were making in your opening remarks about the need to think about what is relevant and what isn't relevant from previous historical periods. What do you think we should take away from the periods covered in this book, and what do you think is just fundamentally different now and we should be cautious of drawing too much from this?
One enduring feature which Chris commented on in his remarks was, well, actually, there were two, the sort of flexibility of the constitution, as he called it, and the extent to which activity went on at the edge of spending and debt. And I have to say that really rings a bell with my time at the OBR. And I suspect that is something which, is a sort of going to be a permanent feature for the sort of reasons that Catherine referred to. Now, I have to say I'm not against flexibility in the fiscal constitution, whatever you want to call it, fiscal rules and so forth, because some flexibility is good. It's impossible to prescribe a rule which is appropriate for all circumstances. So you need to have some room for discretion. And then the question is how you design the constitution or how you build it. There may not be a conscious design thing, in a way that gives you the flexibility when you need it, but also inhibits the malign part of gaming the rules. Now, I think Chris's project is very good at exposing the problem. What I think is really the task ahead is actually trying to identify ways of improving it, which to some extent, falls less to people like Chris who are analysing what's gone on, and more to people like Conrad who are on the inside, and perm secretaries and so forth.
On that point then, Conrad, to what extent do you think the Treasury has learnt these from what happened in this period?
Well, so I guess I would point to, so I suppose the first thing I'd say is I think there is a kind of inevitable boundary problem that you end up in any kind of budgeting system. So, to take the obvious example, there is a difference between giving someone money and lending them money. Yeah. You want to treat those two things differently. But there is also an intermediate case. You could give them an income contingent loan, which is a little bit between lending them money and giving them money. So how do you treat that in your budgeting system where it tends to be the case that there is sort of one thing which is most constrained? I think the right answer to this, is the one which the Treasury has sought to do over this period and is picked up in the book, which is kind of set up some institutions to help take it out of the direct control of of departments and the Treasury. So the independence of the ONS to go away and have a look at these income contingent loans and think about how we should score them in the national accounts. That is very important. The independence of the OBR with a remit to think about fiscal risks and how it should reflect these things in its forecast. I think that is also a very powerful tool. So there's a kind of, inevitably you're going to get into these kind of boundary things. I think the right way to think about them, is exactly that, to have some independent people who will look at it and say, in the big scheme of things, should we treat this slightly differently?
On some of the more interdepartmental issues, there are a couple of the stories that Christopher spells out in the book, that one of them being the 2005 cash to non-cash to cash switch, and a similar one by the MOD in 2002. Have those sorts of, would that happen these days? Have those, what's changed?
So I think that is, I think that is much less likely to happen these days. So, for those not deeply familiar with the story, there was an excellent reform, the introduction of resource account budgeting, which was applied with, full kind of purity of principle to say, we will count the depreciation of these assets, we will have effectively an operating cost control, we will charge capital charges for the assets that you hold, and if you can find some alternative ways of managing your assets, then great, you get to keep money and spend it on something else. And unfortunately, I think that was a little bit too naively applied, and it was too easy for departments who are facing a whole load of pressures, like they've all got their own incentives, to come up with ways that they could save those non-cash charges and switch them. We're not doing a kind of really big root and branch reform like that now. And I think if we were to do so again, I think we might be a bit more cautious about the incentives at the edge, because kind of the lessons of history are that people will follow the incentives of your spending framework.
Right. Christopher, I think your point is that...
I would only make the point, which is made in the book, that the way the Treasury fixed the problem was to make it impossible to switch between non-cash and near-cash. That solved the Treasury's problem, at least short term. But it meant that a lot of the potentially beneficial effects of resource accounting was lost. So it's kind of, you cure the disease, but the patients died. It does mean that the ability of public managers to be creative, for example, in getting rid of surplus buildings or land or what have you, and putting them to more productive uses, that the incentives have really gone to do that, because you can't bank the results. So that seems to be the problem that the Treasury has on that one.
I don't fully accept that, because we do, in the consolidated budgeting guidance right now, if you sell an asset, you can keep the proceeds and spend it on something else. The switching into current spending is less automatic, but it would certainly be the case that if a department came along and said, we've got this great new way of running our assets, the problem in the sort of vignette in the book of the original MOD thing was that they hadn't actually changed anything in the real world. They just looked at all their airframes and said, we reckon these can last a bit longer, so we'll cut the depreciation thing. So there's another section on the spirit of the laws in there, which you rightly say is undefined, but the spirit of the laws still apply.
Brilliant. I want to come to questions from the audience now, so please do put up your hands if you have a question in the audience here. Yep, let's go take the two at the front here, and then take three together. So.
Thank you, and thank you for today. I think it's really important that what you're doing, and I think it should be extended to other policy areas like climate change. I'm currently a freelance environmental economist, but 30 years ago I was economic advisor at the Treasury on transport from 92 to 94. And since I'm probably not in the Treasury's archives, there's one bit of experience and a question largely for Conrad, but welcome for other insights. on that experience. When I was there, I was tasked to devote half my time to immediate firefighting issues and half to long-term matters. On the latter, we had wisely Portillo commission the Fundamental Expenditure Review, and that prompted us to look hard at transport. The Department of Transport came up with a big bid for highways expenditures to cater for increasing road use, and at the time, my Undersecretary, Steve Robson, immediately thought that's not sustainable and tasked me and the policy lead to come up with an alternative solution. And I then worked with them to come up with the road pricing proposition. And on your question of collaboration, as an economist, I was able to work with my economics colleagues in the department on developing the initiative. And as fellow members of the Government Economic Service, we were able to transcend the policy issues that might have separated us, shall we say. So question for Conrad is, are you tasking your teams to devote substantive time to addressing long-term issues? And in relation to Catherine's question, forthcoming election, are you commissioning a fundamental review looking at alternative strategic options on both expenditure, taxes, charges to overcome the major pressures that Charlie's just highlighted for us? Thank you.
I'll gather three questions together and then we'll
Give you a bit more time.
Time to think of the answer.
So historically, it feels like the main department the Treasury's had to do battle with is the Ministry of Defence, but over time, because of the forces Charlie talked about, increasingly feels like that's now the Department of Health. And I wonder how that dynamic changes things.
Thank you. And there was one on the aisle.
Neil Carmichael, former MP as it happens, but now interested in dentistry. When I was listening to this, I was reflecting on the fact that there's been quite a lot of Chancellors of the Exchequer who've actually lasted a long time, despite the last year and despite, I think, John Major's tenure and so on. And that contrasts to the turnover of ministers in other departments. So my first question is, does that really make a difference? How has the longevity of Chancellors actually influenced things as compared to normal ministers? But there's another question lurking around here, which is the Treasury, as Conrad has said, has changed, but not much. Other departments are constantly changing. If you look at their titles, you look at their responsibilities, their size, their scope. And so I'm wondering about the structure of the other departments and how that impacts this question. Because I think fundamentally, if you've constantly got change of the type that I've just outlined or talked about, then it's very difficult to establish that memory, that institutional memory, and also to link the policy bits together.
Great. Thank you very much. So we've got sort of four questions there. One about what the Treasury, how much of the Treasury's spending team time is now on longer term issues. One about whether DHSC has become the MOD of the past. One question about how much it matters that you have long-standing chancellors and a lot of turnover in other ministers, and also about the structure of other departments changing and affecting institutional memory. So, Conrad, let me come to you first, particularly on the long-term issues, but do feel free to pick up on the others if you want.
On the short-term and long-term, the answer is absolutely yes. You do have to keep both the short-term and the long-term issues in view. There's a kind of very interesting bit in the book on the Hayward Fundamental Expenditure Review of the Treasury, which talks about how the spending side of the Treasury should be thinking about kind of causes of spending issues as well as symptoms of spending, and the kind of balance of where you put your time on that is a sort of difficult judgment you've got to make day to day. But definitely, long-term issues are central to what we think about. I mean, on the kind of MOD versus the Department of Health thing, I mean, I don't think things have kind of fundamentally changed. I mean, the numbers are definitely now bigger on the health side, right? So it is by far the largest department, and sort of swings in what happens in the health system are now, proportionally much larger than they were in sort of early points in this book. But the kind of fundamental trade-offs are still the same. You have, the need to provide healthcare free at the point of use, and that is a very, important requirement of government. And you have defence of the realm, and how you should sort of think about geopolitical risks. That trade-off doesn't really go away, and the ways of thinking about it, I don't think fundamentally change.
I think one of the points that Christopher draws out in the book about the MOD is both the complexity of it, which you've already talked about, but also that senior members of the military can be very vocal in public, and that can be quite a good bargaining tactic for them if you get those kind of senior people mouthing off in the press, shall we say, in support of more spending need. Are there similar challenges with the Department of Health and pressure for more spending there, that it's quite a publicly salient issue?
Well, I tend to say the Treasury doesn't comment on leaks. I don't think, in any spending review or in any, allocation process, there is going to be public debate about different priorities. It comes out in different ways. But that is a sort of valid, indeed an important part of allowing the politicians to make the decisions they need to make.
Christopher, from your work, did you draw out any differences between different departments? What were the sort of issues with different departments that stuck out for you?
Certainly the issue of how spending was allocated within the department, and the difference between departments like health, where most of the is just passes through the department to the health trusts, and so then you've got the whole question of how it is that the health trusts manage their money. They're supposed to break even and avoid deficits. That may have changed, but I don't think so. And then there's the question of what the reality of that is. And we certainly found in that vignette that you described right at the start of the book on the health crisis of 2005, health spending crisis of that year, was that the Treasury wasn't able to get inside the health trust to figure out how big the deficit in their spending was going to be, because the department didn't know either. And that seems to me to be the big challenge for the Treasury in health spending control. I did want. Would you allow me to just comment on Neil Carmichael's point as well about the length of tenure of chancellors and churn in departments? Certainly, there's no question that causes problems for the Treasury on spending control, because of the difficulty they then have in reworking out the baselines for the units that they're then going to be negotiating with. And we certainly found several cases, I'm sure this is all gone now, where the Treasury simply had no idea of what the baselines were for some departments, and didn't remember what the delegation limits were either. And that was partly because it all kept changing. It wasn't only that the Treasury people were changing, but the structure of departments was changing. So I think you're right. You're right about the importance of that. I'm not sure what to say about the length of tenure of chancellors, but it is certainly true that they varied in all kinds of ways over our period. We interviewed all of them, and some. Well, this is on the record, isn't it? Kenneth Clarke had held many of the other big jobs like Home Office, and he'd been in the health, the Minister of Health as well. So he knew all which hospitals had unused land and that kind of thing, and that he carried that knowledge with him then to the Treasury, so I think that it is definitely the case that the background of chancellors affects the way they do the job. No question about it.
Charlie, do you want to pick up on any of these questions?
Well, the one thing I will pick up on is the Ministry of Defence versus Department of Health and Social Security, and where they're really sort of quite similar. Because surely there's an important difference in that most health spending is for now, because, you know, people are getting ill now and so forth, whereas defence spending is precautionary, if you like. It's against the risk of war, which means that there's much more scope to argue, you know, do you really need another battleship, or, you know, so many more Typhoon fighters or whatever, and where the threats are coming from, because it's all a sort of contingent thing. Whereas with health, I assume it's really much harder to push back when health professionals are saying, you know, if you don't give us the money, you know, we're not going to have enough beds and people are going to be dying from X, Y, and Z. So there is a sort of an important difference in the nature of the spending, which I would have expected to feed back into the nature of the discussions between the Treasury and the departments.
On longevity, I mean, you know, let's face it, whatever the title, First Secretary of State and Deputy Prime Minister and so forth, the Chancellor is the number two. It's the most powerful one.
Chancellor's number one.
When you've got a weak Prime Minister, it's often number one. And so there is, there are reasons why you are going to have longevity there. Sometimes it's a political friend like George Osborne. Sometimes it's a bit of a rival like Gordon Brown, and that makes it harder to move somebody. But also, it really matters, solidity there. You know, we've seen what happened in the Truss government when you start to have turmoil and the way in which the markets react. So, longevity and stability is obviously something that prime ministers prize in the appointment of their chancellors. So it is more likely during periods of political flux that you're going to see a higher turnover of chancellors. But I mean, I think the other thing to say about that is that what we only see when you've seen a chancellor there for a long period of time is the sort of distillation of almost an ethos behind that chancellor. You know, Brown's approach to the Treasury, George Osborne's, Howe, Lawson, even going back to sort of Butskellism. It's that kind of distinct identity of a chancellor and their way of approaching, whether it's the economy or the public finances, by and large it's the economy, that really comes out of longevity. Just briefly on the FE, whatever, I can't remember what it's called. The first
Fundamental expenditure.
Thank you. Sorry, I had a mind blank. My own view is that all departments should be doing some kind of strategic audit in the run-up to an election. It's just good practice anyway. It gives you that opportunity to be able to devote some resources to sort of taking stock of the department, thinking about what are we getting right, what are the sort of big long-term issues that actually we've not been able to deal with, and what's our advice if there is a change of government, what is our advice to a new government of things that they might want to think about, but also how can we make sure that we're giving them the best department we can, and if we know that we've got some underlying issues, how can we get ahead of them rather than a new government coming in and finding out problems. So I think all departments should be doing something along those lines.
Great. Let's just squeeze in a couple of questions from online before we finish. I'm afraid we may not have time for more. I'm trying to get one more from the audience. So one question from online from Anonymous. Says, why doesn't government evaluate the effectiveness of policies and programmes more to learn what is working and what is not? Perhaps particularly to Conrad, to reflect on what government does do on that front. Second question, also from an anonymous questioner, asks, do you think there needs to be much more focus on upskilling civil servants in finance and how to challenge plans through a financial and non-financial lens? And perhaps I'll merge into that one another question, which asks, is economics more important than accounting with respect to the Treasury? And I'll take a final question on the aisle at the back there.
Thanks, Iain McLean, one of the co-authors. To the discussion we've been having about longevity of ministers, I think it's worth saying that since our book is about public expenditure control, an equally important question is the longevity of chief secretaries, who would normally be the minister most concerned. And I think it's probably not controversial to say that the most consequential chief secretaries in the period covered by our book and before were the two with longest tenure, namely Joel Barnett before our period started, and Danny Alexander during the entire coalition government. And then there's a sub-theme as to whether the Chief Secretary actually has a job to do, is familiar with the job, is allowed by the Chancellor to do anything, matters about which we collected quite a lot of anecdotal evidence, but no generalisation is possible.
Thank you very much.
Shall I go first and be quicker,
yeah.
and then you can end with the author or something? On evaluation, I was actually going to mention the evaluation task force, what works and so forth, in terms of government has got better at learning from what it has done previously, but there is still a lot more that can happen. And, talking to ministers, it is often the last thing on their mind, partly because the churn that we've talked about, you're trying to think about what you can actually achieve in the 12, maybe 18 months, maybe 2 years that you're in office. So looking at how somebody else's policies worked previously isn't necessarily at the top of your priorities. There's still an issue there, but it is a lot better than it used to be. Upskilling the civil service, agree also upskilling MPs. We haven't talked about it, but another theme in the book is the somewhat archaic approach of Parliament of how it scrutinises public expenditure, and I think there could be a lot more that we do for MPs and for ministers on their sort of ability to be able to scrutinise and hold to account. And longevity of chief secretaries is a great point, Iain, and it kind of feels like it is a place, a role that has become one of those sort of, you plonk somebody in there to give them a boost in the hope that then you'll give them some other sort of important job, or you just put somebody in who's a safe pair of hands for a little bit until you can move the chess pieces around again. And I don't think it is fully prioritised as somewhere that you should have somebody for a long enough period of time. But then at the moment we are in an era of very short spending review periods, so hopefully at some point in the future we will get back to longer time frames for thinking about public expenditure management.
Charlie?
Yes, if I can pick up on the first two elements and pull them together. So I'm all in favour of doing more policy evaluation, both ex ante and ex post, but to do that you actually need the skills. So it sort of connects with the second question and upskilling. And here I just want to give a plug because one of my responsibilities at LSE is to jointly run an executive masters in public policy that we have for UK civil servants. So these are mid-career types, or 7 or 8 years into their careers, and that programme is built around a core of economics, political science, and government and so forth, and empirical methods which are suitable for policy evaluation and the like, as well as options to do various other things. So over time, we're helping to try and upskill the civil service.
Excellent. Do your bit. Conrad?
So I'll pick up a couple of those. So on evaluation, I mean, I couldn't agree more. I think one of the really important things for the Treasury here is you need to have, to encourage more evaluation, you need a virtuous cycle where, things that are working have a decent evaluation, have kind of catch the eye of the Treasury, more likely to attract resources. Things which are not working, you can reallocate the resources to try new things. The evaluation task force, which is something very passionate about, has been a real positive thing here, but we do need to do more. And then on kind of finance, and I can't resist economics versus accounting. One of the nostalgic things about the book is the sort of it describes the sort of atmosphere in the Treasury of the early 2000s of quite a lot of distance between the accountants and the sort of policy officials. And I remember I was a sort of lowly policy official in GP, who I'm pleased to hear have good filing. History is written by the winners. You know, I remember at the time discovering the existence of this person called Hot Gas, the head of the Government Accounting Service, which was sort of, you know, separately in some ivory tower in the Treasury. Hot Gas is now my boss, the second permanent secretary. I'm a qualified accountant. Half of the people who are the sort of civil service, senior civil service on the Treasury side are qualified or part qualified accountants. Like the kind of, I think we have worked really hard to break down the false division between economics and accounting. They're both incredibly important skills.
Christopher, final word for you.
I totally agree with what Iain said. He's speaking for the team there. It's just a very important point, obviously true. As far as how do we train civil servants, there is quite a bit in the book about efforts to do just that, particularly on project evaluation and evaluating business cases, but also going to departments as well as the Treasury. A lot of effort going into that. And certainly in the book we go through the various generations of green books, the Treasury's Guide to Evaluation, which is its principles are mandatory for some kinds of things. So therefore, it's important, and not just for academic curiosity, but for civil servants to do their job, to get on top of these green book developments. And the green books changed enormously over our period, away from important, of course, but not perhaps all important issues about what discount rate you should use for evaluation. Important, yes, but there are other things that need to be factored into evaluating projects, and a lot of progress was made on that. It's slow going, and one of the very small number of Treasury people who does that job said to me, it's like hunting an elephant with a pea shooter. And so I think they maybe needed a few more weapons if they're going to hunt this elephant.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much. I'm sorry we haven't had time for all of the questions that were, but thank you very much for joining us. Thank you to our excellent panel for really interesting remarks. And thank you to the Nuffield Foundation for supporting this event and for supporting the programme of work. I do hope lots of you will go away and buy the book. As we've already said, it is very digestible and has lots in there that will be very relevant to anyone thinking about these sort of issues today. Thank you very much.